Good morning. Now, in 1919, 1 year after the First World War ended, thousands of people came here to the cenotaph to remember those who lost their lives. Since then, generations have continued to come to pay their respects. Now, we'll talk more about this now with the historian Kate Williams, who joins me. Good morning, Kate. Let's just think back to the end of the war. That moment, it was 5 o'clock in the morning, I think, the Armistice was signed. And then 11 o'clock when the guns fell and the fighting stopped. How was that celebrated?
Yes, 5 o'clock the armistice was signed, and then there was some fighting did continue to 11 o'clock, and then at 11 o'clock, when the time sounded, it was all over for the war across the world. And in the streets, it was announced to all the civilians. So here in London, in the big cities, all across Britain, you saw these absolutely joyous celebrations. People poured into the streets, they were overjoyed. In fact, it is recorded that actually people think like the trams didn't work because no one went to work. They were so excited. But actually, on the fighting front, on the Western Front, the men there were almost too shocked to celebrate. They were too surprised. They were emotionally drained. So they did celebrate. They talked to the Germans. They shook hands and bowed. But it was almost as if they were overwhelmed, really, with what they saw was the future of reconstruction.
And although there was jubilation to some extent, but exhaustion, as you say, back here at home, the socio-economic situation was quite bleak, wasn't it? People had been living with rations. People were struggling to understand what the war was about and what the future held.
Yes, they've been living with rations, they've been living with poverty. It had been a struggle on the home front to survive. Many people had been, obviously, I don't think there's a single family in this country that wasn't touched by what had happened, what was going on. So there was great suffering. So really, people were joyous, jubilant, thrilled, but it had this other side of the coin, which was how we're going to survive in the next years when they knew there was huge reconstruction to be done across Europe, and it wasn't going to be an easy task at all.
We should talk about the role that women played in the war as well, because there was a great support effort here, back at home.
There was a huge support effort, and initially the government were quite resistant to using women in the war, but by 1916, when full conscription was brought in, when there was conscription for men, it was accepted that women were needed. So the women set off to assist the army, the navy, the air force. They did all kinds of incredibly important jobs, clerical, signalling, organisation, and I think we do have to remember the incredible bravery of the female ambulance drivers who get very close to the front, driving these ambulances full of wounded men. They were shot at, they were attacked, and the bravery of the women on the Western Front, across the fronts, and also here at home when they were working in all kinds of jobs that they'd never worked in before, and they really kept the country going, kept the world going.
This is a good point to talk about one woman in particular. For one woman today, particularly poignant today, I think, Grace Jones is the oldest person in Britain. She's 112 years old, but was just a schoolgirl when World War I broke out. She vividly remembers the euphoria of the war ending, as we've spoken about, but also the pain, as many did, of losing her brother. David Garnston went to meet her.
Lovely to meet you.
This is Grace Jones, the oldest lady in the United Kingdom at 112 years. And I went to see her at her home in the Cotswolds.
That's my father, and that's me.
She is one of the very few with personal memories of 1914, when war was declared.
I can remember people saying the war has started, and people crying, and then, of course, I suppose their husbands or boyfriends, they had to go to the war.
The conflict touched every family, including Grace's. Her brother Tom signed up and served in Gallipoli. There are no surviving pictures of the dashing young man who went to war.
He was a lovely brother, but he was in Australia and the war started. I can always remember my father had a letter saying that he should join up. He joined up and he was killed. That was a very sad time.
"100 years ago this weekend, on November the 11th, the nation erupted in relief as the guns fell silent, and Grace was there on that first Armistice Day.
People with Union Jacks screaming and laughing and singing my elder sister took me down where the cars were. There were no cars where I lived. And to see the people dancing all in the road and on the tram cars, the open ones, singing away. It was lovely. I remember that.
Grace Jones talking there, remembering. And Kate, it's so important to hear stories and to hear the memories of people like Grace 100 years on. A whole generations have no idea really of what happened.
It's so important to hear from Grace and what she went through and what she suffered and what so many people suffered, that brilliant footage that you were showing of the joy and the excitement, but also people's acceptance that things were really going to change. And that is I think, so much of the point today, that we are commemorating the war, the end of the war, but also the suffering and sacrifice, and that we must never forget.
What did the war mean to this country? It was something that people had never seen before. It was a war that people expected to be over by Christmas.
They did expect it to be over by Christmas, and it was called the Great War. It was seen as the war to end all wars. And for many people who'd grown up in the Victorian period, war was something that happened overseas. It didn't touch them at home. It was just something that involved the actual standing army. So conscription, the fact that there were home front, the fact that there was obviously attacks on people within Britain. This was a real shock. And it really did change people's worldview here. People suddenly realised that what they had in terms of what they thought was security was fragile. So you see a real change. It's a movement towards fragility, and it's a movement towards accepting that the world may not be at peace. But what happens is incredible optimism, this incredible feeling that with this great and terrible and dreadful war, they put an end to war forever.
Kate, we'll be talking to you throughout the morning. Thank you very much. I should tell you what's going on here in London. Police are getting the area ready, of course. We'll be seeing Prince Charles lay a wreath of commemoration outside the cenotaph, representing the Queen later, as he did last year, and processions throughout the country as well. Chris will have the headlines with you shortly. Remember, 100 years since the Armistice. A year after the war ended, thousands of people came here to the cenotaph to remember those who'd lost their lives. And since then, generations have continued to come to pay their respect. We'll talk now to the historian Kate Williams. Kate, thank you very much for talking to us. It's a poignant day, isn't it, 100 years on. What was the scale of the First World War compared to the others?
It's an incredibly poignant day. This was the Great War, the World War. It's very hard to get exact records, but we do estimate that about 10 million soldiers were killed across the world, and that's all over the world, including the Empire soldiers and soldiers in many countries that were caught up in the war. And we estimate about 8 million civilians, and that includes famine and disease. So the toll it took on people across the world is almost unimaginable.
And if we break down those who were involved in the war, a remarkable number of young men were on the front, weren't there?
Yes, when the call came out, when the war broke out in 1914 for young men to volunteer voluntarily, we did have a huge amount of young men. The actual age was 19. We estimate about 250,000 of the British Army, so that's a huge contingent of the British Army were under 19. And in fact, the first British soldier killed in World War I was actually a young man who was just 17, John Parr.
We'll talk more, Kate, throughout the programme. Thank you. Well, one of the most famous stories of the Great War is when on Christmas Day 1914, British and German soldiers had a brief truce.